The words stuck in his throat like gravel scraping against raw flesh. Every syllable required a scream, a desperate push of air through vocal cords that looked like shredded ribbon under the glare of medical lights. Dwayne Miller stood before his Sunday school class on that January morning in 1993. A man whose entire life had revolved around speaking, now reduced to sounds that made listeners wince. The room held 60 people, maybe more, all leaning forward with strained expressions, trying to decode the raspy whisper that passed for his voice. He'd been teaching them about Psalm 103 for weeks now, but today felt different, heavier somehow, as if the air itself pressed down with unbearable weight. The cassette recorder on the podium turned silently, capturing everything, though no one knew yet that they were documenting the impossible. Beyond the walls of Houston's First Baptist Church, the city hummed with ordinary Sunday rhythms, unaware that in this modest classroom, the boundary between the natural and supernatural was about to dissolve. 3 years earlier, Dwayne Miller had been a different man entirely. As senior pastor of First Baptist Church in Brenham, Texas, he'd possessed what colleagues called a preacher's voice, rich, commanding, capable of filling sanctuaries without amplification. His sermons drew crowds not just for their content, but for the sheer power of delivery. The way his voice could thunder with righteous conviction or soften to a whisper that somehow reached the back pew. He'd built his entire vocational life around words, preaching, teaching, counseling, encouraging hand. His voice had been the instrument through which God's call found expression. Then came January 1990, and with it, an ordinary flu that carried extraordinary consequences. The virus penetrated deep into the myelin sheath, protecting the nerves of his vocal folds, destroying tissue that doctors assured him would never regenerate. What began as simple laryngitis hardened into permanent damage, leaving him with a voice that sounded, as he would later describe it, like the worst case of laryngitis you have ever heard, and I could only make that if I screamed at the top of my lungs. The medical pilgrimage that followed became its own form of wilderness wandering. Over 3 years, Dwayne saw more than 63 specialists, leading teams that totaled over 200 doctors. They prodded, scanned, biopsied, and ultimately shook their heads in clinical sympathy. The nerve damage was catastrophic, and irreversible words that echoed in his mind during sleepless nights. When despair felt more real than faith, he couldn't call his daughters at Baylor University because operators thought he was making obscene calls. He couldn't order food at restaurants without drawing stares. The simple act of asking his wife to pass the salt required such Herculean effort that mealtimes became exercises in frustration and grief. His toolkit, as he called it, everything he'd ever used to earn a living or fulfill his calling, had been stolen by a microscopic invader that left his body intact, but his purpose shattered. By 1991, the congregation he loved released him with tears and prayers, understanding that a pastor without a voice was like a pianist without hands. Before we continue, leave your like, share our story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. The move to Houston felt like exile, though his wife never said those words. They settled into a new normal where she became the breadwinner while Dwayne wrestled with questions that had no comfortable answers. What did it mean when God called you to something, equipped you for it, and then stripped away the very thing that made it possible? The philosophical wrestling matches happened mostly in Valenza. Cruel irony, not lost on him, as speaking even to himself required too much energy. They began attending Houston's First Baptist Church, a massive congregation of nearly 20,000 where anonymity felt like mercy. He could sit in the back, mouth the words to hymns, and avoid the pitying glances that had become unbearable in Brenham. Depression settled over him like a wet blanket, heavy and suffocating, made worse by the knowledge that his faith, a thing he'd spent decades teaching others to strengthen, felt paper-thin in his own hands. The pit that David described in the Psalms wasn't metaphorical anymore. Dwayne lived in it, and the sides were too slick to climb. In April 1992, the directors of a Sunday school class called the Catacombs, named for its original meeting place in the church basement, approached Dwayne with a request he immediately wanted to refuse. Their regular teacher needed time away for personal reasons, and they wanted Dwayne to fill in temporarily. He protested that no one could understand him, that it would be torture for everyone involved, that surely they could find someone better suited. But the directors, a husband and wife team, refused to accept his excuses. "We'll listen really carefully," they promised, their eyes holding something that looked like stubborn hope. Dwayne later came to understand that their persistence wasn't about his teaching ability at all. It was about love, about knowing how desperately a drowning man needs something to reach for, even if reaching hurts. So he agreed, reluctantly, to teach while they searched for a permanent replacement. Each Sunday became an ordeal, 45 minutes of shouting into a microphone pressed against his lips, followed by days of recovery when even his damaged voice needed rest. The class members sat with necks craned, faces tense with concentration, trying to catch every tortured syllable. Most gave up after a few weeks and stopped coming. Unable to endure the acoustic suffering any longer, the weeks crawled by with glacial slowness, each one chipping away at whatever reserves of faith Dwayne still possessed. He'd chosen to teach through Psalm 103, perhaps hoping that meditating on God's benefits would rebuild something inside himself. But the words felt hollow coming from his mangled throat. "Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all his benefits," benefits that seemed to have forgotten him entirely. By the time he reached verses 1 through 5 on that January morning, he'd never felt less faith in his entire life. The pit David wrote about had become his permanent address, and he'd stopped believing in ladders. His daughters were grown, his career was finished, and his purpose felt as damaged as his vocal cords. If God was listening, he'd gone mysteriously quiet, at least as far as Dwayne could tell. The classroom that morning held the usual suspects, faithful souls who'd stuck it out despite the acoustic torture, plus a few visitors who didn't yet know what they were in for. The cassette recorder turned on the podium, capturing everything for absent members, a weekly routine that felt as meaningless as everything else. Dwayne began reading. His voice, the familiar rasp of tortured air and damaged tissue. "Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all his benefits." The words scraped out, each one an effort, a reminder of everything he'd lost. He moved through verse 2, about God's forgiveness, the syllables costing him everything they always did. Then came verse 3, and he read the first part, "Who forgives all your iniquities." Standard stuff. The kind of scripture he'd preached 1,000 times before the virus came. But then he reached the second phrase, the part about healing, and something happened that no medical textbook could explain. His voice, that broken, rasping, desperate excuse for a voice, began to change not gradually, not over minutes or hours, but in the space between one word and the next. The rasp smoothed into clarity, the strain melted into strength, and suddenly, impossibly, Dwayne Miller was speaking with a voice that hadn't existed for 3 years. "Who healeth all thy diseases," he proclaimed, and the words rang through the room like a bell, clear and strong and utterly transformed. The classroom erupted in gasps and sobs, people leaping from chairs as if electrified. Dwayne stood frozen at the podium, his mind struggling to process what his throat already knew. Something impossible was happening. He touched his neck, felt his Adam's apple moving normally, and tried again to speak. "I'm healing," he said, the words emerging smooth and effortless, as if the previous 3 years had been erased in an instant. The cassette recorder captured it all. The moment of transformation, the stunned silence that followed, the wave of emotion that crashed through 60 witnesses simultaneously. Someone shouted, "Praise God," and others joined in. But Dwayne could barely hear them over the roaring in his own ears. His hands trembled as he gripped the podium, not from weakness but from the overwhelming awareness that he was standing in the middle of a miracle. The voice that had been stolen was being returned, not through surgery or therapy or medicine, but through something far more mysterious, the same power that parted seas and raised the dead. Now at work in a suburban Sunday school class on an ordinary January morning, he kept testing his new voice, speaking sentences just to hear them come out clearly. The class laughed and cried in equal measure, some running from the room to find others who needed to witness this impossible thing. Within minutes, word spread through the massive church like wildfire. The man who couldn't speak was speaking. The pastor whose voice was destroyed was declaring praise in tones that resonated with restored strength. Dwayne's wife appeared in the doorway, summoned by frantic messengers, her face transforming from confusion to wonder as she heard her husband speak for the first time in 3 years without screaming. The catacombs classroom became holy ground that morning, a place where heaven had reached down and rewritten biology, where faith that seemed dead had erupted into undeniable proof. Medical impossibility gave way to divine reality, and everyone present knew they'd witnessed something that would mark them forever. The cassette tape kept turning, preserving for history the exact moment when silence was defeated and a voice was born again. In the days that followed, Dwayne underwent examination by the same specialists who'd declared his condition permanent. They stared at his vocal cords under bright lights, comparing them to previous scans and photographs, searching for explanations that their training could accommodate. The nerve damage they'd documented so thoroughly had vanished, replaced by healthy tissue that showed no signs of ever having been compromised. One doctor after another reviewed the evidence, scratched their heads, and used words like remarkable and unexplained clinical euphemisms. For what they all knew but couldn't professionally acknowledge, they were looking at a miracle. The news spread beyond Houston, beyond Texas, carried by radio programs and news articles and the testimony of 60 witnesses who'd been there when it happened. Focus on the Family obtained the cassette recording and broadcast it nationally, letting millions hear the exact moment when God interrupted a Sunday school lesson with healing. Dwayne's phone rang constantly with requests for interviews, speaking engagements, and from people sharing their own stories of divine intervention that had been dismissed or forgotten. The response from the medical community varied from cautious interest to outright dismissal. Some physicians suggested that perhaps the nerve damage had been healing gradually all along, that the sudden improvement was merely the culmination of slow regeneration. Others pointed to psychosomatic factors, arguing that Dwayne's disability had been partially mental and the classroom environment had triggered a psychological breakthrough. A few skeptics claimed the original diagnosis must have been wrong, that 3 years of consistent findings from over 200 doctors somehow represented mass incompetence rather than accurate assessment. But none of these explanations could account for the instantaneous transformation. The way damaged tissue became healthy tissue between one word and the next. None could explain why the healing coincided precisely with reading scripture about God healing diseases, or why it happened in a room full of witnesses rather than privately where doubt could flourish. The skeptics could construct alternative narratives, but they couldn't erase the recording, couldn't unhear what had been captured on magnetic tape for anyone willing to listen. The restoration extended beyond physical healing into every corner of Dwayne's life. He returned to ministry, not in the same role, but in a new calling shaped by the wilderness he'd traveled. Speaking engagements took him across the country, where auditoriums filled with people desperate to hear from someone who'd been through the pit and emerged on the other side. His message wasn't triumphalistic or simplistic. He never claimed that faith guaranteed healing or that suffering proved lack of belief. Instead, he spoke with hard-won wisdom about the mystery of God's ways, about how sometimes miracles come and sometimes they don't, but faithfulness matters regardless of outcomes. He wrote a book titled Out of Silence, detailing the journey from despair to restoration, and it resonated with readers who'd learned that Christian life wasn't always victory laps and answered prayers. The book came with the cassette recording, letting people hear for themselves the moment when heaven invaded earth in a Houston classroom. His wife, who'd carried the family through 3 years of financial and emotional strain, found her own healing in watching her husband restored. The daughters, who'd grown accustomed to a father who couldn't call them now, heard his voice regularly, sharing conversations that had seemed permanently lost. The congregation at First Baptist Church treated him as living proof that God still moved in miraculous ways. Though Dwayne constantly redirected attention from himself to the one who'd done the healing, he reconnected with the church in Brenham, the people who'd released him with tears and prayers. And they wept again, this time in gratitude. As he stood in their pulpit and preached with the voice they thought they'd never hear again. Every word that came from his mouth felt like borrowed grace, a gift he hadn't earned but had received anyway. Not because he deserved it, but because mercy sometimes looks like restoration when nothing else will do. The community of believers who'd prayed for him through the dark years claimed the healing as their own answered prayer, evidence that intercession matters, even when it feels futile. The ripple effects of that January morning touched lives far beyond Texas. People who'd lost hope for their own healing found it, rekindled by Dwayne's testimony. Those who'd been told their conditions were permanent started asking different questions, wondering if medical finality was really as final as doctors claimed. The recording circulated through churches and Bible studies, played for skeptics and believers alike, offering audio evidence that couldn't be easily dismissed or explained away. Some listeners came to faith for the first time, convinced by what they heard that maybe God was real after all. Others recommitted themselves to prayers they'd abandoned, willing to believe again that heaven might interrupt their circumstances with power that looked like healing. Dwayne never promised that everyone would experience what he had. He'd seen too much suffering and unanswered prayer to offer false guarantees, but he testified that God remained capable of anything, including the impossible things that medical science declared couldn't happen. The years that followed brought their own challenges. Because healing doesn't make life simple, Dwayne still struggled with doubt on hard days, still wrestled with questions about why some prayers get answered dramatically while others meet with silence. He met countless people with destroyed vocal cords who desperately wanted the same miracle he'd received. And he prayed for them knowing that most wouldn't experience sudden restoration. The tension between his healing and others' continued suffering never fully resolved, leaving him in the uncomfortable space where testimony and mystery intersect. But he learned to live there. In that space where faith doesn't demand answers before it believes, where the evidence of one miracle doesn't require that all circumstances change the same way. His voice, that restored, impossible, miraculous voice, became a tool for speaking into that tension, for helping others navigate the disappointment of prayers that seem unheard, while simultaneously holding on to hope that God moves when and how he chooses. The wilderness he'd traveled gave him credentials to speak about suffering that easy faith could never provide. Decades later, the cassette recording still circulates, now digitized and shared across platforms that didn't exist when it was made. New generations discover it and hear the moment when silence broke, when a man's screaming rasp transformed into clear proclamation in the middle of reading scripture. The medical community still debates what happened, offering theories that grow increasingly complex as they try to explain away what simpler hearts accept as divine intervention. But the evidence remains. Testimony from dozens of witnesses, audio documentation of the transformation, medical records showing before and after conditions that don't match, and a man whose restored voice proclaimed God's healing power for the rest of his life. Skeptics can dismiss it as coincidence, or fraud, or misdiagnosis, but they can't make it disappear. The miracle stands in the historical record, refusing to be erased by disbelief, or reduced to something more comfortable than what it actually was. A moment when heaven reached into Houston and rewrote biology, because mercy sometimes looks like restoration. The legacy of that January morning extends beyond one healed voice into larger questions about faith and suffering. It challenges the easy answers that religious communities sometimes offer, refusing to support either the claim that faith always brings healing or the cynicism that dismisses miracles as delusion. Dwayne's story sits in the complicated middle ground where most human experience actually lives, a place where sometimes God intervenes dramatically and sometimes he doesn't, where prayers get answered in ways we couldn't predict and other prayers seem to bounce off heaven's ceiling unanswered. The miracle doesn't resolve the problem of suffering or explain why some people walk out of hospitals healed while others die despite desperate prayers. What it does is establish beyond reasonable doubt that the category of impossible isn't as fixed as we sometimes think, that the natural laws we take as absolute can bend when divine power decides to operate, that the boundary between what can and cannot happen is more permeable than skepticism wants to admit. For those who struggle with Dwayne would be the first to say that includes most honest believers at some point. The recording offers a strange kind of comfort. It doesn't promise that your particular prayer will be answered the way you want. Doesn't suggest that faith is a formula for getting what you ask for, but it does establish that God can intervene. That miracles haven't been retired to biblical history. That the power that raised Jesus from the dead still operates in the modern world. That knowledge might not change your circumstances, but it can change how you hold on to hope when circumstances look hopeless. The voice that was destroyed and then restored stands as evidence that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the impossible gives way to the miraculous. And knowing that such things can happen, that heaven can interrupt earth with power that looks like healing, makes it a little easier to keep believing even when your own prayers seem to hit a ceiling of silence. Dwayne's testimony doesn't solve the problem of unanswered prayer, but it does suggest that the conversation isn't over. That God might be waiting to speak into our circumstances in ways we can't yet imagine. The Sunday school class that witnessed the miracle that day never forgot it. For them, the catacombs became a name with double meaning, not just the basement room where they'd originally met, but the tomb from which resurrection emerges. They'd watched death turned backward, impossibility transformed into reality, medical finality overruled by divine decision. That memory shaped how they prayed afterward, giving them confidence that God could do anything He chose to do, even if He chose not to do it every time they asked. They became people who'd seen behind the curtain of natural law, who knew from personal experience that the physical world isn't as solid as materialism claims. That spiritual power can reshape material circumstances when heaven decides to move. Their faith wasn't naive or easy. Many of them had their own unanswered prayers, their own wilderness seasons, but it was grounded in witnessed reality. They'd heard the voice transform, watched their teacher's face light with wonder, felt the atmosphere change as heaven invaded their ordinary Sunday morning. That kind of experience doesn't leave people unchanged. The cassette recording itself became a kind of secondary miracle, a piece of evidence that couldn't be erased or revised by failing memory. Too often, miraculous experiences fade into, did that really happen? Questions as years pass and skeptical voices raise doubts. But Dwayne's healing was preserved in magnetic oxide, captured by technology that had been running for entirely practical reasons, making the lesson available to absent class members, and which accidentally documented the moment when practical reality got interrupted by supernatural power. The recording meant that skeptics couldn't dismiss the testimony as exaggeration or faulty memory. They could listen for themselves, hear the rasp transform into clarity, and decide whether to accept the evidence or construct elaborate alternative explanations. Most chose the latter, because accepting the recording at face value required acknowledging that their naturalistic worldview had gaps large enough for miracles to slip through. But the recording kept playing, kept bearing witness, kept offering evidence that something impossible had happened in Houston on a January morning in 1993. For Dwayne himself, the restored voice came with responsibility. He couldn't pretend the healing was ordinary or downplay its significance without dishonoring the gift he'd received. So he spent the rest of his life testifying, speaking, writing, sharing the story wherever people would listen. He never claimed to understand why he'd been healed when so many others with similar conditions received no such miracle. He couldn't explain the mind of God or offer formulas for guaranteed healing. What he could do was witness to what had happened, share the recording that proved it, and invite others to wrestle with the implications. His voice, once destroyed and now restored, became a tool for pointing beyond itself to the one who'd restored it. Every sermon he preached, every conversation he had, every time he opened his mouth to speak, the miracle continued, not just the initial transformation, but the ongoing reality that he could speak at all. The gift never became ordinary, never faded into taken for granted normalcy. He remained aware until his death that every word he spoke was borrowed grace, evidence of mercy he hadn't earned but had received anyway. The story challenges comfortable categories on all sides. For those who believe that faith healing ended with the apostolic age, Dwayne's experience presents awkward evidence that God still operates outside natural law when he chooses. For those who claim that sufficient faith always produces healing, his 3 years of unanswered prayer before the miracle undermine that equation. For skeptics who dismiss all miracles as delusion or fraud, the documented evidence, medical records, audio recording, multiple witnesses makes easy dismissal impossible. The story sits in the middle of everyone's theological system, refusing to fit neatly into anyone's predetermined boxes. It insists on being what it actually was, a specific moment when God intervened in one man's suffering with power that looked like instantaneous healing, happening in a way that was documented and witnessed but not easily explained. The miracle doesn't validate any particular theology completely, but it does establish that the category of miracle remains open. That God hasn't retired from the business of intervening in human circumstances. Perhaps the most powerful aspect of Dwayne's testimony isn't the miracle itself, but what came before those 3 years of unanswered prayer, failed treatments, and deepening despair. The healing gains significance precisely because it interrupted such profound suffering, because it came to a man who'd stopped expecting it, because it happened when faith felt weakest rather than strongest. The story doesn't suggest that miracles reward great faith, or that suffering indicates lack of belief. Instead, it testifies that God's mercy sometimes shows up in the middle of the pit. When we've exhausted every human option and lost the ability to hope. The voice that emerged in that Houston classroom was born from silence and despair. From 3 years of living in the gap between calling and capacity, from the death of dreams and the loss of purpose. That's what makes the restoration so just that it happened, but that it happened to someone who'd given up believing it could happen. The miracle found him in his doubt, met him in his darkness, and spoke restoration when he had no faith left to summon. The theological implications ripple outward in ways that continue to provoke discussion and debate. Does Dwayne's healing mean that God can always heal, but chooses not to? Does it suggest that miracles happen more often than we recognize? Should we pray with more confidence for healing? Or does the rarity of such dramatic interventions mean we should temper our expectations? These questions don't have simple answers, and Dwayne never pretended they did. What he knew was that God had healed him when medicine said healing was impossible. And that knowledge changed everything about how he understood prayer, faith, and divine power. He learned that God's ways remain mysterious even when they're miraculous, that mercy doesn't follow formulas we can predict or control, that the boundary between natural and supernatural is more fluid than our categories suggest. The miracle didn't give him all the answers, but it did establish that the God who created vocal cords in the first place could certainly repair them when he chose to do so, regardless of what doctors declared impossible. For everyone who heard the story, whether through the cassette recording, his book, his speaking engagements, or the testimonies of those who'd witnessed the miracle Dwayne's healing, became a small crack in the walls of naturalistic certainty. It suggested that maybe the universe isn't as closed to divine intervention as modern skepticism claims. That perhaps the testimonies we dismiss as superstition might sometimes point to actual events that transcend natural explanation. The evidence was compelling enough to make dogmatic materialism a little harder to maintain, subtle enough that those determined to disbelieve could still find alternative explanations. But the crack remained, a fissure in the certainty that miracles don't happen. That prayer is just psychological comfort, that faith has no objective impact on physical reality. One restored voice in one Houston classroom on one January morning, a small thing in the grand scheme of history, yet large enough to keep hope alive for everyone who heard about it and wondered if God might interrupt their circumstances too. As years turned into decades, Dwayne's story joined the long tradition of healing testimonies that stretch back to the early church and continue into the present. His miracle wasn't unique in kind. Other vocal healings have been documented, other impossible restorations verified, but it was uniquely documented, captured on audio in a way that made denial more difficult. The recording ensured that his testimony wouldn't fade into legend or myth, wouldn't be dismissed as exaggerated memory or religious enthusiasm. Anyone could listen and hear for themselves the moment when biology bent to divine will, when the natural order paused to let supernatural power operate, when a voice emerged from silence because mercy sometimes looks like restoration. That documentation matters because it grounds faith in evidence, gives hope an objective anchor, reminds skeptics that the category of miracle remains open regardless of their philosophical commitments. The cassette kept turning long after Dwayne's death, kept bearing witness, kept offering proof that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, heaven interrupts earth with power that changes everything. The final chapter of Dwayne's life brought its own challenges: new illnesses, the normal aging process, the reality that one miracle doesn't mean immunity from all suffering. He experienced the same mortality as everyone else, eventually facing conditions that this time weren't healed miraculously but required medical intervention or simply had to be endured. That reality doesn't diminish the miracle of his restored voice. It contextualizes it, placing it within the larger story of a human life marked by both suffering and restoration, both answered and unanswered prayers, both mountaintop experiences and valley floor struggles. The healing was real, profound, and documented, but it was also a moment within a longer narrative, not the end of the story, but a pivotal chapter that changed how Dwayne understood everything that came after. He died eventually, as all people do, but he died with a voice that medical science said he should never have possessed, bearing witness until the end that God had intervened when intervention seemed impossible. This account emerges from carefully documented sources, chronicling one of the most rarefied healing miracles in modern Christian history. The testimony of Pastor Dwayne Miller's vocal restoration has been examined by medical professionals, broadcast on national radio programs including Focus on the Family, and preserved through audio recording of the actual moment of healing on January 17, 1993. Multiple publications have investigated the story, including medical documentation showing nerve damage before and healthy tissue afterward, testimony from over 60 witnesses present in the classroom, and Miller's own detailed account in his book Out of Silence, a personal testimony of God's healing power. The event occurred at Houston's First Baptist Church during a Sunday school class, and the cassette recording that captured the transformation has been studied by both believers and skeptics, seeking to understand what happened when a permanently damaged voice suddenly became clear and strong while reading Psalm 103:3. This narrative draws from these documented sources to tell the story of a miracle that refuses to be dismissed or forgotten, standing as evidence that sometimes the impossible gives way to divine intervention in ways that can be heard, witnessed, and verified by anyone willing to examine the evidence.